Franziska Keller woke at 5:43 in the morning on the 2nd of December, 1961, and before she opened her eyes, she knew something was wrong. The baby was not moving. She lay still for a moment, counting. She had been counting for weeks. Every morning before dawn, lying in the narrow bed in the house in Stolberg, Germany, she counted the movements. The midwife had told her to count 8 movements minimum before 8 in the morning. It was a way of knowing the baby was still there, still alive, still coming toward her. She counted to 60. Nothing. She counted again. The room was cold. Her husband Werner was still asleep beside her, his breathing slow and even. Outside the window, the sky was the deep gray of a German winter morning before first light. She pressed her hand against her stomach and waited. Nothing. She got up. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table, and by the time the tea had gone cold, she had convinced herself it was nothing. Some mornings the baby was simply quiet. The midwife had said that too. Some mornings they sleep. You sleep, and the baby sleeps, and you do not need to worry about every quiet hour. She took the small white pill from the bottle on the counter. She had been taking it every evening for 4 months. Sometimes in the mornings too, when the nausea was bad. It was called Contergan. Her doctor had prescribed it. He had called it completely harmless. He had called it the safest sedative available for pregnant women. Chemie Grünenthal, the company that made it, had called it completely safe for use at any stage of pregnancy. They had said so in their advertising. They had said so in their letters to doctors across West Germany and the United Kingdom and Canada and Australia and 34 other countries. They had known that was not true for at least 2 years before Franziska Keller took that pill at her kitchen table in Stolberg. They had the letters. They had the reports. They had the doctors writing to them from across Europe, describing children born without arms, children born without legs, children born with hands growing directly from their shoulders and feet growing directly from their hips. A condition with a name that no one had needed before. Phocomelia. Seal limbs. Because the limbs were not formed. Because something had reached into the development of these children in the first weeks of pregnancy when the limbs were still becoming and stopped the process completely. They had the letters. They kept selling the drug. Franziska Keller's daughter was born on March 17, 1962. She was missing both arms below the elbow. Her legs ended at the knee. She was alive. She was healthy in every other way. She cried when she was hungry. She turned toward her mother's voice. She had her father's eyes. Her name was Ingrid. She is 63 years old. She is still waiting for a formal apology from the company. And here's what nobody ever told you. The drug was called thalidomide. It was synthesized in 1954 by a chemist named Wilhelm Kunz at a West German pharmaceutical company called Chemie Grünenthal, based in the town of Stolberg in North Rhine-Westphalia. The company had been founded in 1946 by a family called Wirtz. Before 1946, one member of the Wirtz family had been investigated by Allied authorities for manufacturing products using slave labor from concentration camps during the war. The investigation was closed. No charges were filed. The family began their pharmaceutical company. This is where thalidomide began. Grünenthal marketed thalidomide as a sedative, specifically as a sleeping pill. More specifically as the safest sleeping pill that had ever existed. Their initial tests had shown that even in enormous doses, animals given thalidomide did not die. You could not overdose on it. This was, in 1957, an extraordinary selling point. The barbiturate sleeping pills then on the market could kill you if you took too many. Thalidomide appeared not to be able to kill you at all. What they had not tested, or had tested incompletely and then stopped, was what the drug did to a developing fetus. The drug went on sale in West Germany on October 1, 1957, under the brand name Contergan. By 1958, it was being sold across Europe. By 1959, it was in Australia, Canada, Japan, and 30 other countries. It was sold over the counter in West Germany without a prescription. You could walk into a pharmacy in Hamburg or Munich or Stuttgart and buy thalidomide the same way you bought aspirin. Grünenthal's advertising positioned it explicitly for pregnant women. Their marketing materials from 1958 described thalidomide as, quote, completely safe for mother and child, quote, non-toxic, quote, suitable for any stage of pregnancy. Their advertising specifically showed pregnant women. Their sales representatives specifically told doctors that pregnant women with morning sickness were an ideal patient population for thalidomide prescriptions. They had no evidence that thalidomide was safe in pregnancy. They had never tested it in pregnant animals. They had never run controlled trials in pregnant human subjects. They had no evidence. They had marketing materials. They treated those marketing materials as if they were evidence, and they distributed them to doctors in 36 countries, and the doctors, trusting that a pharmaceutical company would not make claims it could not support, prescribed accordingly. The first letters began arriving at Grünenthal's offices in late 1959. The first letter came from a doctor in Hamburg named Widukind Lenz. He had not yet connected the drug to the deformities he was seeing. He was simply describing what he was seeing and asking if anyone else had noticed anything similar. Children with shortened limbs. Children without ears. Children with internal organ malformations. A cluster of cases that had no precedent. He had 5 cases. He thought it was worth mentioning. Grünenthal's medical department received the letter, logged it, filed it, did not respond. More letters came. By mid-1960 there were dozens. By late 1960 there were hundreds. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore from the outside. But inside Grünenthal's offices in Stolberg, the letters were being answered with the same form response. The company was aware of no connection between thalidomide and any reported birth defects, and any reports of adverse effects should be understood as coincidental and unrelated to the compound. They sent this letter to doctors while their own internal scientists were beginning to express concern. The man who would eventually expose what Grünenthal had done was not a regulator. He was not a journalist. He was a pediatric neurologist in Hamburg named Widukind Lenz, and by the autumn of 1961, he had 49 cases on his desk, and he had found the pattern. It was the timing, the specific timing. Thalidomide reached its target, the developing limb buds of a fetus, between the 27th and the 40th day after conception. That was the window. Before day 27, nothing happened. After day 40, nothing happened. But inside that 14-day window, thalidomide interrupted the process by which limbs form. It stopped the signals. It prevented the vessels from developing. It reached into the most fundamental biological instruction set of a developing human being and turned off a switch that was never supposed to be turned off. And Lenz had something more specific than the timing. He had a question. He had gone back to the mothers of all 49 children. He had asked every one of them the same question. Had they taken any medication during their pregnancy? What medication? When? For how long? 46 of the 49 had taken thalidomide, in the exact weeks when their child's limbs were forming. Every single one of them had been told the drug was safe for pregnant women. On November 15, 1961, Widukind Lenz telephoned Chemie Grünenthal's headquarters in Stolberg. He spoke to their medical director. He told him what he had found. He told him the drug needed to be taken off the market immediately. He told him that every day it remained on sale was another day that another woman, somewhere in West Germany, was taking a pill that was going to prevent her child from having limbs. Chemie Grünenthal did not take the drug off the market that day. They asked for more time. They said they needed more data. They said the evidence was not yet conclusive. They said withdrawing the drug would cause unnecessary alarm among the medical community and unnecessary anxiety for patients who had been taking it safely for years. They said all of this on November 15, 1961, while having known for at least a year that doctors across Europe were writing to them with cases that fit exactly the pattern Lenz was now describing. They kept the drug on the market for 11 more days. Contergan was withdrawn in West Germany on November 26, 1961. 47,000 packets of Contergan were still in circulation when the withdrawal was announced. The company asked pharmacists to return the packets. No record exists of how many were returned. No record exists of how many were already in kitchen cupboards across Germany, sitting on counters beside the tea and the bread, waiting for morning sickness that had not come yet. The United Kingdom did not withdraw their version of the drug, branded as Distable, until December 2, 1961. Canada did not withdraw it until March 1962. Some countries continued selling it until late 1962. In total, by the time thalidomide was off the market everywhere, an estimated 10,000 children worldwide had been born with thalidomide-related deformities. An estimated 5,000 did not survive their first year. The 5,000 who survived were left to build lives without the limbs they should have had. But what you have just heard is not the whole story. Not even close. Because in the United States, none of this happened. In the United States, 10,000 children were not born with missing limbs. In the United States, a 37-year-old pharmacologist named Francis Kelsey looked at the application Grünenthal's American licensing partner submitted to the Food and Drug Administration in September 1960, and she said no. And then she kept saying no. Francis Kelsey had joined the FDA in August 1960. The thalidomide application, submitted by the American company Richardson Morel, who had licensed the drug from Grünenthal, was one of her first cases. It would have been, by the standards of the time, a straightforward approval. The drug had been on sale in Germany for 3 years. It had been sold across Europe. Millions of people had taken it. No one had died from an overdose, which was the primary safety concern for sedatives at the time. Kelsey read the application and found the data incomplete. Specifically, she was concerned about the neurological side effects that had been reported. Peripheral neuropathy, a tingling and numbness in the extremities that was being reported in long-term users. She was concerned because peripheral neuropathy in adults suggested the drug could cross the blood-nerve barrier. And if it could cross the blood-nerve barrier, she wanted to understand how it behaved in relation to developing neural tissue in a fetus. She asked for more data. Richardson Morel submitted more data. She read it and found it incomplete. She asked for more data again. Richardson Morel submitted again. She read it and found it still incomplete. This process, Richardson Morel submitting, Kelsey refusing, continued for 18 months. During those 18 months, Richardson Morel's representatives visited the EFTA repeatedly and pressured Kelsey directly to approve the application. They sent letters to her supervisors describing her as unreasonable, obstructionist, and unable to process scientific evidence objectively. They lobbied her office. They wrote complaint letters. They said she was holding up an important and beneficial drug for no scientific reason. She held her ground for 18 months. She asked for the data. She got incomplete data. She refused approval. She asked again. By the time Richardson Morel finally withdrew the thalidomide application in March 1962, after the story was breaking in Europe and the connection to birth defects had become undeniable, it had already distributed 2.5 million thalidomide tablets to American doctors as free samples. The tablets were described as investigational, not approved for sale, but they were in doctors' offices across the United States. They had been given to patients. Some of those patients were pregnant. 17 American children were born with thalidomide-related deformities. 17. Compared to 10,000 in the rest of the world, 17 was the number that resulted from one woman's refusal to be moved by pressure from a company that wanted her to approve their drug without adequate evidence. Frances Kelsey never made a speech about it. She reviewed the science. She asked for more data. She said no. That was all she did. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy awarded her the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. It was the highest honor that could be given to a civilian government employee. She received it in a ceremony at the White House. She was 57 years old, and she had been doing her job. The trial of Chemie Grünenthal began in May 1968 in Aachen, Germany. 9 company executives and officials faced charges that included grievous bodily harm and negligent homicide. The prosecution had assembled a case that stretched across 12 years of corporate conduct. The evidence included internal memos written before Contergan's launch in 1957. It included letters from doctors that had been received, logged, and filed without response. It included the testimony of the mothers of thalidomide-affected children. It included the calculations of exactly when specific children had been exposed and exactly what limbs were missing as a result. The trial lasted 2.5 years. It was the longest pharmaceutical trial in German legal history at that point. In December 1970, before the verdict was reached, Chemie Grünenthal reached a settlement with the German federal government and the Victims' Association. The settlement provided 42 million Deutschmarks, approximately $100 million in today's money, to be distributed among the surviving thalidomide victims in Germany. In exchange for this payment, all criminal charges against the 9 executives were dropped. No executive of Chemie Grünenthal spent a single day in prison. Heinrich Michter, the head of Grünenthal's Pharmaceutical Research Division, the man who oversaw the development and marketing of thalidomide, and who presided over the decision to continue selling the drug after the adverse reports began arriving, was never convicted of any crime. He received the Federal Cross of Merit from the West German government in 1970 for his contributions to the pharmaceutical industry. He died in 1987 with his reputation intact. The 42 million Deutschmarks settled the German cases. It provided nothing for the 10,000 children born in the other 35 countries where thalidomide had been sold. The British victims received a separate settlement from Distillers Company Limited, which had sold thalidomide in the UK under the brand name Distaval. The Sunday Times of London, under editor Harold Evans, had spent years publishing the stories of British thalidomide victims and their families, demanding that distillers increase their initial settlement offer, which was widely regarded as inadequate. Distillers eventually paid £37 million. The amount, divided among the survivors, provided a base of financial support but nothing that addressed the lifetime of additional medical costs, prosthetics, surgeries, and care that the thalidomide-affected community would require. In Canada, where the drug had been sold under the brand name Kevadon by Richardson Morel, the company settled with victims quietly and privately. The terms of those settlements were subject to confidentiality agreements. To this day, the full terms of what Richardson Morel paid to Canadian thalidomide survivors have never been made public. Here is what was in the file they did not show the doctors. In 2012, investigative journalists and researchers examining Grünenthal's internal archives, documents that had not been made public during the 1968 trial, found evidence that the company had known about neurological side effects in adults as early as 1959. Internal documents showed that the company's own medical team had been tracking reports of peripheral neuropathy, the nerve damage in the hands and feet of adult long-term users, and had not disclosed this to regulators or to the medical community. The same archive contained evidence that some early animal tests had produced results concerning enough to flag for further testing. The further testing had not been completed before the drug was launched commercially. The same archive contained the letters. Hundreds of them. Letters from doctors across West Germany, the United Kingdom, and Europe, written between 1959 and 1961. Letters describing children with missing limbs, deformed ears, absent eyes, internal organ malformations. Letters asking whether other doctors had seen similar cases. Letters asking whether the company had any information about possible causes. All of them received, logged, stored. Many of them never answered. The 2012 discovery of this archive triggered renewed calls from thalidomide survivors and their advocacy organizations for a full, unconditional public apology from Chemie Grünenthal. The company had issued partial statements over the decades. They had acknowledged regret. They had described what happened as a tragedy. They had never said, "We knew." We had the data, and we continued selling the drug. In September 2012, at a ceremony in Stolberg, marking 50 years since the drug's withdrawal, Chemie Grünenthal's chief executive Harold Stock issued what the company described as a full and unreserved apology. He spoke of pain and grief. He spoke of decades of silence that he called too long. He did not mention Heinrich Machter. He did not mention the letters. He did not mention the dates on the internal documents showing when the company first had data it did not disclose. He did not mention the 11 days between November 15, 1961, when Widukind Lenz called the company and told them the drug was causing the deformities, and November 26, when it was finally withdrawn from sale. The survivors were not satisfied. Several left the ceremony before it concluded. Ingrid Keller, who had attended, was asked by a reporter how she felt. She said, "I have been waiting 60 years for someone to tell me why. No one has answered that question yet." The story did not end in 1962. This is the part that most people do not know. This is the part that makes what happened to the children born in the late 1950s and early 1960s not history, but active present tense. Thalidomide is still being manufactured. Thalidomide is still being sold. Thalidomide is a legal approved pharmaceutical compound in 2026. It is used in the treatment of multiple myeloma, a blood cancer, and of a severe complication of leprosy called erythema nodosum leprosum. In these applications, in carefully controlled settings with robust pregnancy prevention protocols in place, it has genuine therapeutic value. And yet, in Brazil, the country with the largest leprosy burden in the world outside of India, thalidomide has been legally available and widely used in leprosy treatment since the 1960s. The pregnancy prevention protocols that exist in theory in Brazil have not been consistently implemented in practice. Between 1965 and 2005, an estimated 1,000 additional thalidomide-affected children were born in Brazil. In a country where the original thalidomide tragedy was supposed to be a closed chapter, 1,000 more children were born into it. The youngest Brazilian thalidomide victims are 19 years old. This is not history. These are people who were born in this century. And then there is the financial structure of the modern thalidomide market. When the FDA approved thalidomide for multiple myeloma treatment in 1998, a decision made after careful review of its benefits in that specific population with strict pregnancy prevention requirements, the drug was licensed to a company called Celgene. Celgene priced thalidomide at approximately $30 per capsule in the United States. The drug itself had no remaining patent protection. It was a 60-year-old compound. The active molecule cost pennies to synthesize. The $30 per capsule price was for the distribution system and the pregnancy prevention program and the administrative infrastructure required by the FDA. Those are legitimate costs. But a myeloma patient taking thalidomide can pay more than $10,000 per month for a drug that costs almost nothing to produce. Celgene became a $12 billion company. In 2019, Bristol Myers Squibb acquired Celgene for $74 billion. The thalidomide molecule, which had destroyed the bodies of 10,000 children, contributed substantially to that acquisition price. The drug continued generating revenue. The survivors continued living in the bodies the drug had given them. No portion of the modern thalidomide revenue has been allocated to the original survivors. Ingrid Keller, who is 63 years old and has spent her entire life without arms below the elbow, received the last payment from the German Thalidomide Survivors Fund in 2014. When the fund was restructured, her annual payment was revised. She manages. She says that word the way people say words that have carried too much weight for too long. She manages. She has never been told, in formal terms, by any company, government, or regulator why her arm stopped forming in the spring of 1962. She has never received an explanation of what her mother was told about the safety of the drug. She has never received an explanation of what Chemie Grünenthal knew and when they knew it and what they chose to do with that knowledge. She is still waiting. The system that was supposed to prevent thalidomide did not prevent it. Understanding how the system failed is not an academic exercise. The system's failure is identical in structure to pharmaceutical failures that have occurred since 1962 and that are occurring now. Understanding it is the only way to understand what is coming next. In 1957, when thalidomide was launched in West Germany, pharmaceutical regulation was minimal by modern standards. There was no requirement for a drug company to demonstrate efficacy before selling a drug. There was no requirement for controlled clinical trials. There was no requirement to test a drug in pregnant animals before licensing it for use in pregnant women. A company could synthesize a molecule, run some basic toxicity tests, establish that it did not immediately kill the animals they tested it on, and then go to market. This was not unusual. This was standard practice across the entire pharmaceutical industry in 1957. Every country where thalidomide was sold had the same regulatory gap. Every country relied to some degree on pharmaceutical companies to police their own safety data. Every country assumed that a company would not sell a drug it knew to be dangerous. The thalidomide disaster changed this. In the United States, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, passed in October 1962, required for the first time that pharmaceutical companies demonstrate not just that their drugs were safe, but that they were effective, and required pre-market approval based on controlled clinical trials. In the United Kingdom, the Medicines Act of 1968 created the Committee on Safety of Medicines and mandated clinical trial requirements. In Germany, the Arzneimittelgesetz, the drug law, was completely rewritten in 1976. These reforms were necessary. These reforms saved lives. The regulatory infrastructure that now governs pharmaceutical approval in the developed world, the infrastructure that requires years of clinical trials and independent review before a drug can be prescribed to a pregnant woman, was built in direct response to what happened between 1957 and 1962. But there is something that has not changed. The regulatory infrastructure depends on the data that pharmaceutical companies provide. Independent regulators review that data. But they review the data that exists. They do not review the data that was generated and then not submitted. They do not have access to the internal letters and memos that a company keeps in its own archives. They review what they are given. The thalidomide case proved that a pharmaceutical company was willing to continue selling a drug after its own internal communications contained evidence of serious harm. The regulatory reforms of the 1960s improved oversight significantly. They did not, could not, eliminate the fundamental information asymmetry. The company knows more about its own drug than any external regulator can ever independently verify. This is not a historical problem. In 2002, internal documents emerged showing that GlaxoSmithKline had possessed data suggesting Paxil increased suicide risk in adolescents and had not disclosed that data to regulators. In 2004, Merck withdrew Vioxx from the market after evidence emerged that the company had possessed cardiovascular risk data earlier than it had disclosed. In 2019, Purdue Pharma, as you may have seen on a previous Dark Verdict video, settled for $8 billion after evidence emerged that it had withheld data on OxyContin's addiction potential. The pattern does not change. The drug changes. The company changes. The decade changes. The pattern, internal data, non-disclosure, continued sales, eventual exposure, does not change. Thalidomide was not an exception. Thalidomide was the template. There is one more thing that requires saying before this is finished. One more piece of this story that is almost never told. Frances Oldham Kelsey saved approximately 9,983 American children from thalidomide-related birth defects. That number, that almost 10,000, is what her refusal was worth. She was one person. She was doing her job. She had been given a specific authority, the authority to review pharmaceutical applications and refuse approval if the evidence was insufficient. She used that authority. No more than that. She never said that what she did was heroic. She never said it was exceptional. She said she followed the science. She said she asked for the data. She said she did not approve a drug for which she did not have adequate evidence of safety. She said that was what her job required. She continued working at the FDA until she was 90 years old. She retired in 2005. She died in 2015 at the age of 101. She had spent 60 years watching the system she worked inside fail in various ways and succeed in others, and she had kept showing up and doing what her specific authority allowed her to do: review the data and hold the line. The thalidomide story is, in the end, a story about two systems operating simultaneously. The first system was a pharmaceutical company that sold a drug it had not adequately tested to women it had told were its safest possible users, concealed the adverse data as it came in, and continued selling the drug for 2 years after the evidence of harm was, by any reasonable scientific standard, conclusive. That system produced 10,000 children with preventable disabilities. That system produced no criminal convictions. That system produced a settlement payment, a withdrawal, and a decades-late apology. The second system was a single government employee in Washington, D.C., who looked at the application and looked at the data and said, "This is not enough," who was pressured and lobbied and complained about by a corporation that wanted her to say yes, who said no, who kept saying no, who held the line until the line held. These two systems ran in parallel between September 1960 and March 1962. The first system destroyed. The second system prevented destruction. The difference between them was not technology or resources or regulatory power. The difference was one person who decided that insufficient evidence was insufficient evidence, regardless of who was asking her to overlook it. That person existed. That decision was possible. Every equivalent institution in every equivalent position had the same possibility available to them. Most of them chose differently. Ingrid Keller turned 64 this spring. She lives in Munich now, in a flat she has adapted over 60 years of living without arms below the elbow. She cooks her own meals. She drives. She does not describe herself as defined by what happened to her before she was born. She has said in interviews that she does not think about the drug every day. She thinks about her life. She has a life to think about. But there are mornings when she wakes and, for a moment, before she is fully conscious, she reaches for something with an arm she does not have. It is not grief, she has said. It is not even memory. It is the body making the gesture it was supposed to make. The gesture that was interrupted before she existed. Franziska Keller, her mother, died in 2019. She spent 57 years never being told, formally by anyone who owed her an explanation, why the pill on her kitchen counter on a cold December morning in 1961 had done what it did. A company in Stolberg, Germany, knew the answer for years before the drug was withdrawn. They kept that answer in a filing cabinet. They answered the doctors who asked with a letter saying there was no known connection. They kept selling the drug. No one went to prison for it. The company still exists. I will see you in the next one.